Once again, I'd like to welcome everybody. We have some visitors and want you to know that you're welcome. And thank you very much for being here with us to worship God and show us that the things that are talked about in the scriptures are important to you. That's encouraging to us, and we thank you for being here. Today's the day that we kind of complete at least this round of talking about the kings. And we only got through about a third of them. Maybe if another semester sometime, we'll pick it up from here and keep going. I don't know. We'll see how things play out. But wanted to just take a moment to express what a privilege it's been for me to be the discussion facilitator. I don't know if some of you men have had the experience in sometimes teaching a class where you just have to pull comments out of the group. Well, that is not this group, and I particularly like that and enjoy that about this group, and it just makes it a privilege to teach the class, and thank you very much for participating in the discussions as we've gone through this. It's like I say, it's been a real privilege and an honor for me. Before we begin this morning, Nick, would you lead our minds in prayer, please? So as I look back over the quarter, one of the things that strikes me is whatever possessed me to think that we could get through all of the kings in one quarter. There's just so many good lessons in here, and I've, as the theme for today, or the lesson for today is going to be some of the themes and the patterns that we've seen in looking at the kings that we've looked at. And I'm probably going to cheat just a little bit and bring Manasseh into the final slide, even though we didn't cover him, but I think it's important to make my final point. That's what we're going to try to do today. We're going to try to talk about some of the patterns and themes that we've seen as we've gone through the kings that we've discussed in this class. Before we get into that, I wanted to ask the group, why do we do this? Why do we look back to the Old Testament and study these lessons from the kings? What is the value? Why do you think we spent a whole quarter doing this? And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? See a couple hands. Yes, sir, James. Thank you, James. That's Romans 15 and verse 4, and that's one of the verses I wanted to bring up. What James just quoted was Romans 15 and verse 4, and it says, the things that were written before were written so that we might have understanding. And then it goes on to say, I can't quote that verse, because somebody turn to Romans 15 and verse 4 and just read the rest of it, because I want to get to the part. Go ahead, Chad. We might have hope. The last several words of that verse. Very impressive. You pulled that out of your hat, James. Thank you very much. And I wanted to bring that out. The reason that we do this is described to us in Romans 15 and verse 4. For our learning and understanding that we might have hope. These things are supposed to give us hope. If we were talking about the carrot and the stick, this is definitely the carrot. This is definitely the carrot because we're supposed to learn something about God, about our relationship with God, about how God deals with his people that gives us hope. So I don't want to miss that. And in fact, my last slide is really going to probably try to hammer that home, the hope part. But, if I was going to talk about I mentioned that being the carrot. There is a stick part of this also. And I think of Hebrews, the 12th chapter, verses 1 and 2. Although, contextually what's being discussed is, remember, Hebrews, the 11th chapter, the faith chapter, it just mentions all these great men of faith in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. And then in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, it talks about, since we have so great a cloud of witness. I'm just going to stick with that phrase. Actually, could somebody read Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2 for me?
Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing on our eyes on him, Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
Thank you very much. So if there is a stick part of this, it's that when we look at these Old Testament examples, and granted, in Hebrews the 11th chapter, we're talking about great men of faith, and then this verse in the 12th chapter, since we have such a cloud of witness. I'm always cognizant of that, of, these men that we've studied are a cloud of witness against us. What am I trying to say? We have these men or these stories or the good and bad as an example of how God deals with his people. They didn't have that. They didn't have what we have in terms of these compiled stories, these compiled accounts of how God deals with his people. So there's a carrot and a stick here, I think, a little bit. We study these things because it's supposed to lead to a hope that we have. We see that God always keeps his promises. We see that in the Kings. God always keeps his promises. And we also see that when men don't keep their covenant, at some point, God's had enough. And that bears part of this great cloud of witness against us, since we know that by studying these stories. Okay. So again, during this period of the divided kingdom, I think it's interesting. We only got to, right around here, Ahab, and right around down here, Jehoshaphat. So you can see barely a third of the kings that we've talked about. And I bring this slide up every day. I think the thing that you should remember about this slide, the simple thing to remember, Israel, they're all sad faces. And Judah, we have the occasional happy face, and I've tried to bring those in and concentrate on some of those good kings to show that, there were good kings. One of the things we learned, and this could have been one of my 5 points, but it's not, is that, that good kings sometimes do bad things, and that bad kings sometimes did good things. That certainly was a pattern that we saw, not one of the 5 that I chose to enumerate, but like I was explaining to somebody before class, just had to make the cut somewhere. I mean, probably could have come up with 10 patterns that I wanted to discuss this morning, but really only have time to try to deal with 5, and don't know how good I'm going to do at that. So here's today's 5-point lesson that we're going to try to cover. The 5-point lesson that we're going to try to cover is trust God and seek his counsel, and we'll give examples for all of these. Evil companions corrupt. Be extra cautious not to stumble when things are going good. We see that over and over. Remain faithful and devoted to God in our waning years. And finally, this message of hope that I hope is kind of what we walk away with. The coda or the explanation point at the end of this class is that God is always ready to forgive. Even though, in the face of all of these bad decisions that a lot of these kings made, we see evidence that God stood ready to accept them back. And that's one of the things I was trying to emphasize a minute ago, that we learn about God's love for his people by studying the Old Testament. It gives us hope from the verse that James quoted from us, Romans 15 and verse 4. That gives us hope when we see that time after time God is ready to forgive. It gives me hope. It's just, sometimes it's a moot point because it's not that way, but it's an interesting discussion. And I don't want to have the discussion now because we won't get to these 5 points. But have you ever thought about, can a person just be saved if we had the New Testament only? And I think, I've struggled with that just as a fun exercise. And my own opinion is that everything I need to do to be obedient to God under the law that I'm under is in the New Testament. So maybe I could render obedience, but I don't know whether I'd be strong enough to remain faithful because I don't have all of these examples about how God deals with his people, both in faithfulness and in unfaithfulness. I wouldn't have all of those, and I just don't think I would be committed. I don't think we would understand the importance of remaining faithful to God without studying these Old Testament things. Okay, first of all, let's look at a couple of examples of trusting God and seeking his counsel. Now, we're not going to have time to like reread all of these, but it might be good to be prepared to read the consequence verses. So as you look at these slides and you want to pick out one to read, we'll try to read all the consequence verses. So if you want to look at the slide and kind of look 2 or 3 down and pick one out to read, that'd be great, because I'm going to try to call on people to read the consequence verses. But trust God and seek his counsel. Solomon was an example of a king that did not do that. And we could have brought up several ways that he did not do that. I chose to bring up that he multiplied his horses, and he did so from Egypt. First of all, there was a violation of law. It was a violation of Deuteronomy 17:16, which specifically said, don't multiply wives, don't multiply horses. I think verse 17 says wives, but don't multiply your horses. Why is that a thing? What does it demonstrate when you build up your horses? What are you doing? Yes, sir.
You're showing that your confidence is in those things that you're doing.
Amen. Everybody hear Mark? Mark said, you're showing that your confidence is in those things, not God. You're showing that you're placing your confidence in your own ability to accumulate a strategy of defense. And so, hey, I don't need God because I got all these horses. Wrong. And we see that pattern over and over again in the Kings. Can somebody read the consequence? And this is kind of a broad general consequence of kind of Solomon going astray. And there were certainly other contributing factors that are going to make one of these lists here in a minute. But just somebody read 1 Kings 11, verses 9 through 13. 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13.
The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant.
Okay. There was a lot that Solomon did, and certainly idolatry is what's being, alluded to here as well. And Solomon made some other mistakes that led up to that. But, we generally think of chapter 11 of 1 Kings as Solomon's downfall. But earlier in chapter 10, we see Solomon starting to go astray by building up his defenses and not relying or trusting in God. And when he was specifically commanded not to do that, not to build up his defenses. Point 2, Jeroboam. We talked a lot about this. Remember, Jeroboam, not a good king. Jeroboam is mentioned in the description of so many of the other kings as, and he followed in the ways of Jeroboam. And he, walked in the ways of Jeroboam. And what they're talking about with all the kings of Israel that it says that about is, they followed Jeroboam's idolatrous example. And one of the things that was really a head scratcher for us as we went through this is that Jeroboam had an ironclad promise from God that he could have a dynasty just like David's. And there's this whole section where the prophet appears to Jeroboam and says, now listen, if you do the things of God, I will make you a house just like David's. And Jeroboam could have had all that. And this road diverged in front of him. He could have gone this way and followed God, but he chose this way. And the consequences were a nation that, remember the sad faces, never had a smiley face, never had a good king, because he set that initial example. Somebody read the consequence that I marked down for us here in 1 Kings 13, verses 33 and 34. 1 Kings 13, verses 33 and 34.
After this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests from the high places again from among all the people. Any who would, he ordained to be priests of the high places. And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth.
Okay. Jeroboam initiating this path for Israel ultimately led in Jeroboam's house being completely cut off. all of his descendants destroyed, all of his family destroyed. God wanted a clean sweep and completely got rid of the house of Jeroboam. Now that's some very personal consequences. But one of the things, again, and this could have been another point, is how transgenerational impact there is of bad decisions. I mean, another consequence is really just Israel having just this history of multiple dynasties, idolatry, no king being, a good king and being obedient to God. It's just a history of intrigue and murder, and they're always switching dynasties. And Jeroboam set that whole thing in motion, and it didn't have to be that way. He didn't trust in God's promise. We made a big deal about this, appropriately so, when we were going through this, that, let's make the application to us. We have an ironclad promise from God also. We do. We have an ironclad. If you obey me, you will receive eternal life. Okay? If we obey God, if we live our lives in such a way as to try to be pleasing with God, he has provided a sacrifice for us. None of us are perfect. We've all sinned. Romans 3 and verse 23, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. But he's provided a sacrifice for us, and we can get in touch with that sacrifice. We get in touch with that sacrifice through baptism. And that's Galatians 3 and verse 27. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. The set of people that have been baptized are the set of people that have put on Christ. That's how we get in touch with the blood. Okay. So moving on, Asa was an example of both putting his trust in God and not putting his trust in God. And it's really, again, another head scratcher, because the situations for trusting God and then when we're told that he didn't trust God, situations are very similar. The situations are going against a foreign army of superior power. And in the very first instance, we see Asa place his trust in God in 2 Chronicles 14, verses 9 through 11. And Asa is really a good example and prays this great prayer and shows that and tells the people, we're going to put our trust in God and he's going to deliver us. And the consequence of that is in 2 Chronicles 14, verses 12 through 15. Can somebody read 2 Chronicles 14, verses 12 through 15? 2 Chronicles 14, 12 through 15.
So the Lord routed the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Asa and the people who were with him pursued them as far as Gerar, and so many Ethiopians fell that they could not recover, for they were shattered before the Lord and before his army, and they carried away very much plunder. They destroyed all the cities around Gerar, for the dread of the Lord had fallen on them, and they despoiled all the cities, for there was much plunder in them. They also struck down those who owned livestock, and they carried away large numbers of sheep and camels. Then they returned to Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Bob. So we see that here, and Asa's a good king, we see, one of the evidences of him being a good king. He trusts God. God fights this battle for for Judah, and it says that God just routed the enemy here, the Ethiopians. And so with this example from his earlier life, it's really a head scratcher for me why Asa doesn't trust God when he's in kind of a similar circumstances in 2 Chronicles chapter 16. Look at chapter 16. In the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and fortified Ramah in order to prevent anyone from going in or coming out to Asa, the king of Judah. Then Asa brought out silver and gold from the treasuries of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and sent to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, who lives in Damascus, saying, "Let there be a treaty between us." So, kind of interesting, Israel and Judah, after they separated, went to war against each other a lot. This happened during Asa's reign. And remember, Israel's to the north of Judah. And then on the other side of Israel is Aram. And so Asa is able to get word to the king of Aram and say, hey, will you join me in battle? Because they're fortifying these cities against me. They're laying siege to my cities, and I need help. Well, what is he doing asking for help from the king of Aram when he already knows that from experience that God would be on their side? Man, there's a lesson here for us. Who do we turn to when we need help? Well, the first being, the first deity, is the deity, the I am. It's God. That's who we should turn to. But Asa decided to, in this instance, as a real head scratcher, go to the king of Aram. Now, look at 2 Chronicles 16, verses 7 through 14. I'm not going to read all of this, but at that time, Hanai the seer came to Asa, the king of Judah, and said to him, because you have relied on the king of Aram and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Aram has escaped out of your hand. Verse 8, were not the Ethiopians and the Lubim an immense army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord move. And then we're going to stop there. But even Hanai, when he comes and says this to Asa, he points out, you had this earlier experience in your life with a great army, and it didn't matter how great they were because God was with you. And how come you couldn't make that connection this time? And, because of this mistake, if we wanted to talk more about bad decisions that have lasting, Aram continues to be a thorn in the side of Israel. They could have taken care of Aram right here, Hanai says, that he's let the king of Aram escape out of his hand. They could have taken Aram right here. But Asa decided to rely on Aram and trust him instead of God. Okay, we better get to the next slide. So how about evil companions corrupt? That's funny. This was a kind of a late addition to my list. The four of them I had kind of in stone, and then I kept flip-flopping on what I wanted my fifth point to be. And as I kind of prepared the other slides, I kept seeing this come up, and it became an obvious choice for me. So evil companions corrupt. And, we talked about the verse in 2 Corinthians 15 that where we could go and talk about this in the New Testament. But look at these Old Testament examples. Solomon loved many foreign women. Again, we've already been in 1 Kings chapter 11. But look at the direct consequence of Solomon's associating with these foreign women. Now remember, when we made this point, we were going through it. Solomon really violated two commandments here. One, he was not supposed to multiply wives. We've already talked about that. Deuteronomy 17:17 is a violation of what kings were supposed to do. But also, Israel was supposed to keep themselves, Judah and Israel, I guess, were supposed to keep themselves pure from the foreign peoples of the land. Remember, much later, when they go back into the land, they're going to have this problem again, and Ezra is going to put a stop to it, right? Ezra is going to say, we need to pray to God to forgive us and put away these foreign wives that we've taken. It's Ezra, the 9th and the 10th chapter. But here, Solomon's violating other law and taking all of these foreign wives. God said, when he made this command, don't do that because they'll draw you away into their own idolatry. And that's exactly what happened. When God tells us something, it's for our own good. It's for our own benefit. We have a benevolent, loving Father who wants the best for us. Frequently when we're talking in our Monday morning class, Melissa will say, I just don't picture God with that big red button, waiting to press that big red button, anytime we mess up. And she's exactly right. God is long-suffering. Remember the slide, I think my opening slide, it's 2 Peter 3 in verse, 1 Peter 3 in verse 9, 2 Peter 3 in verse 9. I'm still trying to remember, 2 Peter 3 in verse 9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us and not willing that any should perish. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. God loves us. He wants the best for us. So when he tells you, Solomon, stay away from those foreign women, it's not because he's just trying to nitpick. It's doing it for your own good. And Solomon didn't listen to him. The consequence is in verse 4 of chapter 11. 1 Kings 11 and chapter 4, and I will read that one. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Consequence of this bad decision of allowing himself to associate with or have intimate relations with all these women who worshiped false idols is that he was ultimately drawn into that. How about Ahab married Jezebel, whose very name means exalt Baal? That was a bad decision. That was a bad decision with consequences that one might even argue are still being felt today. But certainly within 3 or 4 generations, this had terrible consequences, and not only for Israel, but also for Judah, because of Jehoshaphat making an alliance through marriage and everything else. But this is just a terrible decision, and let's just skip right to the consequence. 1 Kings 21 and verse 25. If somebody's there, go ahead and read that. 1 Kings 21 and verse 25. Talking about how bad Ahab was, we're told that there was none as bad as him. And then we talked a lot about this, about, the temptation is to see Ahab as this guy with horns who's out there, just actively about trying to do evil. But the reality is much closer to home, much closer to something that you and I can probably relate to. One of Ahab's big problems is that he allowed himself to be manipulated. He didn't have backbone. I called him in our class a milksop because he didn't have the strength of character to tell Jezebel, no, that's wrong. Instead, he was complicit in what just happened in this chapter, the murder of Naboth in order to get his vineyard. That he was complicit in that, allowed it to happen, didn't do anything to stop it, and that is kind of the story of Ahab's reign. Is he just kind of tries to ride the waves, whichever direction they're going, and doesn't do anything to show that he's devoted to God. So Jehoshaphat, I mentioned this just a minute ago. Jehoshaphat is a good example of evil companions corrupting, because Ahab was so bad that Jehoshaphat shouldn't have had anything to do with him. But again, this is something we can kind of relate to. Jehoshaphat, I love the point that Ed made when we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Jehoshaphat, this is kind of family. We're all sons of Abraham here. Let's try to, patch things up between the two sides of the family. And I'm going to go down there. I'm going to try to be loving. I'm going to try to have peace. And we made a big point of saying we were going through this. It doesn't matter if it's family. You can't have peace with evil. And that's what Jehoshaphat was trying to do. He was trying to compromise. He was trying to have peace with evil. And he had no business having this relationship with Ahab, much less giving his son to marry into a marriage relationship with Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. We talked about the consequences of that, far-reaching. I think I had to put down a couple of consequences. The first verse in chapter 21, verses 4 through 6, I don't even know that we're going to take the time to read these, but my first citation in 2 Chronicles 21, verses 4 through 6, that's when the rest of Jehoshaphat's sons get murdered by the son that becomes king. The rest of them get murdered. And who is this new king married to? He's married to the daughter of Jezebel. Why wouldn't he do that? In fact, the verse says he decided to follow in the ways of the kings of Israel and not his father Jehoshaphat. Well, if you ever want to do a lesson to the kids on bad companions corrupting good, man, there's a good example right there. He had his father Jehoshaphat for his example. but he chose, probably because of this marriage relationship with Jezebel's daughter, to follow the kings of Israel. What were the kings of Israel doing? Oh, they become king by murdering. There's, all these different dynasties, 9 or 10 different dynasties that you go through the kings of Israel. And it's always done through murder and corruption and all of that. You don't see that as much down in Judah, but here you see it for the first time. And we see it's because of this influence of Ahab and Jezebel. Jehoshaphat allowed himself and allowed his son to be influenced by them. Okay. All right. The next one we're going to talk about is being extra cautious not to stumble when things are going good. We saw this pattern crop up a number of times. And for all of these slides, you guys are probably thinking of examples that I didn't even put on my slide. I don't intend for each of these slides to be complete, and every instance of that we could turn to in the kings that we've looked at is listed here. They aren't complete like that. I've only listed the 2 or 3 that immediately came to mind for me as I prepared the slides. Be extra cautious not to stumble when things are going good. After describing Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and splendor in 1 Kings chapter 10, and largely 1 Kings chapter 10 is devoted to that, talking about Solomon's wealth, talking about his splendor. In fact, the heading, and I know the heading is supplied by men, but the heading of that section in my Bible, I'll just turn to it and tell you what it says. I'd be interested to know what yours is, but mine is, let's see, wealth, splendor, and wisdom of Solomon. And that's verses 14 through the end of the chapter of chapter 10. So we've just got done describing all of Solomon's successes. And now in chapter 11, we read that he makes some bad decisions. After describing Solomon's wealth and wisdom and splendor, the scriptures immediately describe his downfall in 1 Kings chapter 11, 1 through 8. The consequence of his downfall, I think we've already read this in verses 9 through 13. The consequence of his downfall was that God told him, because you have not followed me the way your father David did, because you have decided to turn from me and not wholly devoted your heart to me, because you've done this, the kingdom's going to be split. I'm going to take 10 of these tribes and I'm going to give them to your servant. Okay? And so this whole section, this period of time that we're studying, the divided kingdom, that rests on Solomon's shoulders for the mistake that he made. Lots of times we like to blame that on Rehoboam, and it might be appropriate. Rehoboam made some bad decisions too, but I don't think other kings made bad decisions. I don't think Rehoboam is the reason. I think the scriptures tell us, show us God telling Solomon, it's because you've done this that the kingdom is going to be split. Just terrible consequences. Rehoboam is another example of, and I just wrote the verse right on my slide because it's just it just really nails the point home. This is 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 1. When the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Now, I don't want to make light of this. This is important. And as I was drawing these things up, I thought, I wonder if there's an application to the church here at Ellisville. Things, Lynn and I are relatively new here. I was telling somebody before service, I retired a year ago next week, April 1st, which is very appropriate, right? April Fool's Day, I retired. But I loved, talking with a lot of you who've been here, 15 years and longer, and hearing kind of some of the struggles that Ellisville's gone through and to get to where we are today. And I believe this is a thriving church. Look at all the young people that are out doing God and bringing other young people. And look at the wisdom of the elders that we have. This is a great, thriving church. Okay. From some of these examples, that means we better watch out. That ought to be a red flag for us. Okay? Because when things are going good, that seems to be when men let their guard down. We always talked about this at the office. right? In the drilling industry, the big stair step in technology was the implementation of the AC drive. We went from a DC drive to an AC drive, and that put a lot more torque at the drill bit. And the company I worked for was the first one to introduce the AC drive rigs. And because of that, we became the market leader in the continental United States and in drilling rigs. But as we sat around, that happened in around 1998, 99 when we introduced that. So in the early 2000s, we would sit around the table and we'd look at each other and say, okay, things are going good right now, but what is the next stair step going to be? We need to be thinking and have our guard up because things are going good right now. It's very easy. See it happen to companies all the time. They let their guard down. They don't keep improving. And just, more importantly, we need to be thinking about that in a spiritual way with here in Ellisville. Let's not let our guard down. Let's keep on keeping on and keep on asking ourselves, how can we do even better? It's a lot of what Ryan talks about. How can we do even better? And keep trying to improve in our service to God. Okay. Finally, the last one there is the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the example of David, 2 Chronicles 17, verse 3. And the dread of the Lord was in all the kingdoms of the lands which were around Judah, 2 Chronicles 17 and verse 10. And then it says, and he allied himself by marriage to Ahab, 2 Chronicles 18 and verse 1. Talk about head scratchers. Jehoshaphat had everything going for him. The kingdom of Judah had everything going for it. Jehoshaphat was obeying God. He sent out teachers through the land. He sent out rabbis and people that reported to him out with the law in hand to teach the people the law. And the result of this is that the fear and dread of the Lord fell on all the surrounding nations, and they knew, don't touch Judah and Jehoshaphat. But then Jehoshaphat, when things are going good and he has peace on all sides, he decides, okay, maybe I'll try to cure this division between the north and south and try to ally myself with Israel. It's a bad decision. He allied himself by marriage with Ahab. The consequence of this, 2 Chronicles 21, verses 4 through 6. I think we've already looked at this, but let's just look at it again. 2 Chronicles 21, verses 4 through 6. 21, 4 through 6. Now, when Jehoram had taken over the kingdom of his father and made himself secure, he killed all his brothers with the sword and some of the rulers of Israel also. Yeah, the result of this bad decision, this bad alliance, was that Jehoshaphat's children were murdered and his great-grandchildren. And you follow the story down, and when Athaliah becomes queen, she murders her own grandchildren so that, and then she becomes the queen of Judah. It's just terrible repercussions of this bad decision that Jehoshaphat made. But I guess on this slide we're pointing out that Jehoshaphat made this bad decision when things were going great. Jehoshaphat may have had this sense of security that what could go wrong? Look, everybody fears us. What could go wrong? Well, when you stop obeying the Lord and you ally yourself with the enemies of the Lord, things will go wrong. Okay. Remain faithful and devoted to God in our waning years. We've used this example a couple of times, and it's appropriate in so many ways, but Solomon loved many foreign wives in his old age, and he was drawn in to idolatry. It's really an interesting story. Solomon had this goal of building the temple, and it took, I think, about 20 years to build the house of the Lord. And it seems like while he's focused on that, while he has his hands engaged in doing the Lord's work, he's okay. But then this last 20 years, when he finishes that great work, it looks like he might have let his guard down. And in his waning years, he allies himself with these women, and he allows himself to be drawn in to idolatry. It's really sad. This is one of the sad themes and patterns. Ryan and I were talking about this. Ryan made the point that you could make this point with virtually every king of Judah, and maybe you throw in the ones from Israel too, that in their later years, they make a mistake. Even Josiah, okay, who Ryan's talked about, I never got to. But even Josiah, they all seem to in their waning years, make a mistake. Now, I want to ask myself, is there a lesson in this for me? Do we reach a point? I mentioned a minute ago I retired for a year. Do I reach a point, or do you reach a point where we retire from God? Where we just want to put it on cruise control and say, okay, I spent all these years working for the Lord, and my wife's taught the classes and I've taught the classes. This is my time to lay back and relax. And I hope it never comes to that. And if it appears that it comes to that, somebody slap me upside the head, because that is not the way it ought to be. I mean, I love it that we've got James back here quoting Scripture. The older people need to be showing the younger people that we've got the Lord's Word written in our hearts. We've got this weight of responsibility on us to teach the younger ones. I think about, Paul's message to Timothy, don't let people despise your youth. Paul said to Timothy. Well, I think it's inherent also that we ought not let people despise us in our old age. Don't act in such a way that people are going to go, oh yeah, Rob, he followed after all the kings, and in his waning years, he seemed to, stop doing God's word. There's a lesson in that for me, and I think for all of us as we get older. Asa, in his old age, is when he made this mistake of trusting the king of Aram instead of God. We've already kind of talked about that story and read about it. But, earlier in life, he seemed to really put his trust in God. And then in his waning years, for whatever, there's a message here to me. How does this happen? How is it that when people, all these examples of when people get older in the Scriptures, sometimes they seem to let their guard down, and we're told about things that they did that weren't so good. And we could even talk about David. We're not going to, but we could pull a couple stories out from David in his older years where he made mistakes, and you think, man, after all he's been through, Ryan talked about that a lot. Okay, and finally, Jehoshaphat made this wicked alliance, and we've used that on several of these slides as well. That, when Jehoshaphat was fresh, he was 35 years old when he became king, and he lived for another 25 years, lived to about 60. When he was young, man, you read all the reforms he made and all the things that he did. He got the Sodomites out of the land. He's knocking down the high places. He's just doing, and he's sending out and teaching the law. He's doing a lot of great things. And then later, as he gets older, I don't know, he just, through ambition or something, he says, hey, let's try to patch things up with Israel. And he makes this bad, wicked alliance. Okay, last slide, and the one I wanted to make sure that I get to. And I think if we walk away, if you remember anything from Crazy Rob teaching this class this quarter, let's just remember this, that God always stands ready to forgive. And I mentioned at the beginning of the class, I'm going to use Manasseh as an example. We didn't talk about Manasseh in this class, but he's such a perfect example that I can't help but to use him as one of my 3 examples here of how God is always ready to forgive and accept us back. Rehoboam and all Judah humbled themselves before God. 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 6. This is one I'm going to read. I'm going to turn to 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 6. If somebody else would get 12 and verse 12. Okay, 12 and verse 6. So the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, the Lord is righteous. Rehoboam made some mistakes, and the people followed him. And yes, sir, Nick. Oh, yes, sir. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you, Nick. So Rehoboam made some mistakes, and the people followed him. But when he was called out on it, he humbled himself. The result of him and Israel, the princes of Judah, humbling themselves. Somebody read verse 12 of that same chapter.
When he humbled himself, the wrath of the Lord turned from him so as not to destroy them completely, and things also went well in Judah.
All right. God's wrath turned from him. God was ready, to cut him off, but God's wrath said no. God said, I'm not going to do that. Because he humbled himself, the Lord turned away so as not to destroy him completely. And it says, conditions were good in Judah. It's a result of turning back to God. It's an amazing result. It's 180 degrees different than the direction. That's God standing ready to forgive us. The next point, after being complicit in the murder of Naboth, this is Ahab. In fact, these last two examples, I told Ryan this the other day, if I were just to ask any number of people, who are the worst two kings of Judah and Israel? Just take all the kings thrown together. Who are the worst two kings? A lot of the times, it might get some different answers, but a lot of the times people are going to say Ahab and Manasseh. They're the worst two kings. That's certainly who you and I have talked about being the worst. Ahab and Manasseh. And look at the examples they both provide us. Ahab, after being complicit in the murder of Naboth, repents, actually. He actually repents. 1 Kings 21 and verse 27. Verse 27. It came about when Ahab heard these words that he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and fasted, and he lay in sackcloth and went about despondently. Then the word of the Lord came to Elisha the Tishbite, saying, do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but I will bring the evil upon his house in his son's days. God stands ready to receive our repentance. And even for Ahab, none of us should ever get in a position where, man, we think, oh, well, I'm so far gone. I've done so many bad things that there's just no hope for me. That's not true. If God can forgive Ahab and Manasseh, and we have Christ's blood, God can forgive us. Okay? He's provided that kind of a sacrifice for us. All right, finally, the last example, Manasseh. 2 Chronicles 33, 10 through 12. Back in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, we're going to read this because we didn't go over it in class. 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verses 10 through 12. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and the people, but they paid no attention. Therefore, the Lord brought commanders of the army. They paid no attention. Look, he was doing terrible things. I'm just going to point out in verse 6, he made his sons pass through the fire. He was sacrificing his own sons to idols by burning them. That's how bad Manasseh was. And there's other things that we could talk about that are just hideous. But the Lord tried to speak to Manasseh, but they paid no attention. Therefore, the Lord brought commanders of the army, the king of Assyria, against them, and they captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him in bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. Then in verse 12, when he, Manasseh, was in distress and entreated the Lord God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers, when he prayed to him, when Manasseh prayed to God, he was moved by his entreaty. God was moved by his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him, Manasseh, again to Jerusalem, to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Look, we could spend a couple of classes talking about how bad Manasseh was. I suspect you've heard all of that before. But as bad as Manasseh was, when he humbled himself before God, when he made entreaty of God, God heard that entreaty, and God brought him again back into his kingdom. There's hope for even a sinner like me, folks. There's hope for us because God has provided us a sacrifice. Thank you very much for all your comments and participation in this class.